Well, good evening. It's Thursday evening, and we are continuing in this lecture series on humility and leadership. And it's just a few minutes before start time. And for people who are joining live, and as you're welcoming, welcome. I'll do another welcome once we get on time as far as start time. But there are also the opportunities where people are either catching up or watching at a time that's convenient. I want to give encouragement to people to remember that with this, looking forward to getting your comments, your feedback. Kathy Sands sent me a couple nice emails with both some questions and comments. And, and one of the things is I will end up putting up a definition with this post of my working definition of humility, and as well as some recommendations for some books that you might want to read and follow some of these subjects down in different directions. And in fact, I thought I would give a few suggestions as we have a couple of minutes and we're getting started. And one of the things to know is that when I started the doctorate program, I kind of moved in a new direction for me as far as the books. And that is, as I moved away from doing books that are just paper, because I knew that I would have to go back and do the residencies for the doctorate. And so most of my books in my doctorate are digital. And but I do have some, and I wanted to recommend a couple. And today represents a transition where we're going to start talking about leadership a little bit more, and some of the literature with leadership. And so I thought I would make a couple recommendations of some different books in different directions. The first book I want to recommend to you is Leadership is an Art by Max Dupree. This has been around for decades, but it is excellent. And Max Dupree is a Christian, but he isn't so much trying to write as a Christian. He's really writing as somebody who helped lead an organization and is talking about his leadership skills. And so it really is a good read, even though it's dated. It's talking about fairly timeless principles and his experience. And then for Christians in particular, because he's a Christian and because his focus is so in line as far as the idea of servant leadership, I think most Christians would find reading this to be a very helpful guide if you're trying to wrap your arms around really understanding what is leadership and how it might be done. Now, again, this isn't so much how to lead the church, this is just how to lead. Another one that's similar, but is even a little bit more focused, is Bill Robinson, who used to be the president of Whitworth University in Spokane, which is a Presbyterian college. And so he ended up reflecting as a Christian on his role of leading this organization, and he did it through the lens of Jesus. And so this one again is generally on the concept of leadership, but in particular it's taking a biblical Christian focus of looking at the life of Jesus, and by reflecting on Jesus, really looking at what does it mean for us to lead. Written by a Christian, really to a Christian audience, but probably with somebody with enough experience and track record that if you weren't a Christian, you might still be willing to listen. Lots of great things in here. I really did like this book. Another book that I'd like to recommend is Primal Leadership by Goleman. And if you've ever heard of the concept of emotional intelligence, EQ versus IQ, Goleman is basically the father of that movement. and he wrote a book with a couple co-authors on how to take the wisdom of emotional intelligence and then reflect on it through the lens of leadership. And this is a secular book, non-Christian, talking about the general idea of leadership, but really doing it through this lens of understanding as far as how emotional intelligence and how understanding the way relationships work play such a key part of being an effective leader. I thought it had a lot of wisdom. It was helpful, and I would recommend this. I'm going to give more recommendations as we go along here, but I'm gonna recommend this, but I'm gonna give a warning. This is not light reading, and this is probably somebody where you might want to consider reading this if you are right now practicing and exercising a place of leadership in an organization, and you want to develop a better theoretical framework of understanding how to lead in these changing times. And this is published through Harvard Business Review, Heifetz, lectures at Harvard. This is an excellent book, and we will talk about it a little bit along with everything that I mentioned in today's lecture, which will give you a little bit more context. But what adaptive leadership is effectively about is where we break things down into say, okay, there's basically three different main areas in which we might look at leading in this changing context as far as just the cultural upheavals that we're going through. And the typical language of this is that you break it down into tactical leadership, strategic leadership, and adaptive or transformative leadership. Tactical leadership is the type of expertise where you have a problem and you hire an expert to come and to deal and lead with the problem. And so it's a problem that needs to be fixed, but the simple solution is that you hire an expert and they provide their expertise and leadership, and then they go and fix it. The second type is probably what's most common in business, which is strategic leadership, where you're here and you want to get here, and the expectation is that the leader is going to help the organization move from here to here, and they develop a strategy and they implement that strategy through the team, and they effectively are able to get from here to here. Adaptive leadership is your organization is here, and everything out here is changing, and this change out here affects here. And because it's changing, if you do nothing, this change is going to negatively impact you in such a way that you're at risk for your organization to die. And this is something that the church is experiencing, because we've moved from 1,500 years of what we would call Christendom, where in Western civilization Christianity was seen at the center of the culture, was accepted. Many people just kind of assumed, depending on what country you lived in, that if you were born in America, that makes you a Christian. And very obviously, beginning in the 1960s, we kind of mark that as the beginning of this transition, where you have Time magazine announcing God is dead, and it's really announcing something that had already been taking place. The church had been moved out of the center of the square and was beginning to be marginalized, and now here we are as a church, and we find ourselves in just a much different context as far as life. Where it used to be that the cultural expectations were is that, well, by the time that you got married, you would take your kids to church and have them go to Sunday school because you wanted them to be raised godly. And today, that's just not there. And so in and that's just kind of one example of, in that changing surrounding culture, if you just kind of work off the assumptions of what you always used to do, most likely your organization will die. The church isn't going to die, but that individual congregation may wither because it hasn't been able to reach out and to effectively engage the surrounding culture. Adaptive leadership is for that situation where now this group has to adapt to the larger, and it is considered, now you can make an argument for it, but it is widely considered to be the most difficult and challenging type of leadership. And this book is all about how to lead so that you can help your organization develop adaptive potential, be able to face new challenges, and not just survive but thrive. And it's excellent. So we're now about 8 minutes in, which probably means that I'm not going to quite get done everything that I wanted to, but I was starting with just an introduction of some different books as we're leaning now into this issue of leadership, and to recommend that you, if you're interested in this, you may want to read. And so I want to say thank you again for joining. We finished chapter 2 last week, which it took us a long time to get through chapter 2. Chapter 3 is something where I'm hopeful that we're gonna move through this a little bit more quickly, because it's important, and I want to share with you the flavor of the research that I did as far as reading into these different topics, and in some ways trying to wrap my arms around the subject of leadership and humility. And the way this works is that they have you write a literature review where you share some of the high points of your study, and you frame a narrative where you kind of tell the story so that if other people are doing research, and in this, there was just I found some very good engagement with material that helped formulate my ideas that had an impact on building my biblical theology of humility and leadership. I want to begin by reminding you of my working definition and my long definition of humility that we ended with last week. The biblical concept of humility is the loving decision to disregard the benefits and privileges of our power and status for selfish ends, to deploy our resources and influence for the good of others, and scorning any shame or rejection from the world, to trust in God's promise to lift us up, to share in his glory. That's the long one, and it's loaded and packed, but it has a lot of good stuff in it, and it's trying to capture these big ideas of the Tapenos word group and the New Testament concept of humility. A little shorter definition would simply be: a truly humble person is one who seeks to use his or her power in service to others. Now with that, we're going to shift gears, and we're shifting them towards just this topic of leadership and humility, and the literature around leadership and humility, and this intersection of leadership and humility. And I shared this weeks and weeks ago, but a little bit of review and a little bit more information for you. The revival, the recognition, or maybe just the realization that leadership and humility really do go together, at least in the leadership literature, begins with Jim Collins' work From Good to Great. And Jim Collins is out of Stanford, and his approach was trying to do a more clinical social approach of looking at hard data, building up parameters, and doing a broad sweep of looking at how organizations are run. And in particular, what he was trying to do is he's trying to say, what really sets apart the great organizations across society where these unique leaders of whatever field they may be end up demonstrating some sort of performance level that just is markedly better and different. And this is this idea from good to great, and that and that ability for a sustained period of time to kind of be just running in this place of greatness where you really are charting new grounds, doing new things, becoming a leader in your area that other people then will probably end up following in some way because of the way that you've been able to just chart this path. That's what they were interested in. And they did it in a way where they were looking at hard data of information. And what was interesting about this is something happened that they didn't expect to happen. And one example of this is a guy named Darwin Smith. Darwin Smith, this is in his own words, I never stopped trying to become qualified for the job. This is what he said after a 20-year career in which he led Kimberly-Clark to become the leading paper-based consumer products company in the world. You know, he got hired to be the CEO. When he started, you know, they were just a middling organization among consumer-based paper products companies in the world. And after the end of the 20 years, he had established them as heads and shoulders above everybody else, the leader in his area. And this is his testimony. You know, I just never stopped trying to become qualified for the job. And the thing is that this became one of these special companies that Collins looked at, where it went, they moved from good to great. They experienced this long, sustained period where they became the leader of their industry. They outperformed. They grew larger. What were they doing? And he had a certain bias in his study, and he admits it as he shares the story of the good to great companies and what separates these things. And Collins's bias was, I don't want the answer to be the leader. It's just too simple of an answer. It's just a catch-all. It can't just be the leader. There has to be something else underneath. We're not going to use leadership and just say, oh, well, leaders make the difference. And they admitted it. But they were looking at the data. And they were looking at the data, and what they found in all of these companies, all of these organizations, is that one of the things that separated them was leadership. And they fought against it. I gave the research team explicit instructions to downplay the role of top executives so we could avoid the simplistic credit the leader or blame the leader thinking that is common today. But in the end, they couldn't ignore the data. And so what they ended up doing is to say, what we found is that leadership was a common trait among these organizations. And all of these organizations ended up having a very special kind of leader. And so that you get the idea of this leadership, we're going to call them a level 5 leader. And because they are the ones that just stand heads and shoulders above all the other organizations and the leaders of those organizations, and they help their organizations move from just being good to really heads and shoulders being great among their contemporaries. And then you get this background, and then they come down and then they describe, and here's what we found. There were 2 specific qualities of level 5 leaders that separated them from all other leaders. And all of them, in all 20 of the organizations that they identified, these are the ones, statistically, based on facts, just looking at what they've done, they've moved from good to great. There are these 2 qualities that we found in every one of the CEO leaders, the people who led the organizations. Humility and an iron will of just being committed, of moving things forward and not being and not being defeated and not giving up, but continuing to say, no, we're going to push in the right direction. Now there were other skills, there were other competencies that these leaders had, but all those other competencies were similar traits that you would find among all the other leaders that they looked at. But the other leaders that didn't get their companies to move from good to great didn't have those two qualities. And very obviously, humility was the surprising thing. Iron will kind of made sense. And now what's unique is that as they lean into this, they sit there and they recognize, but one of the reasons why we're using the language level 5 leadership is that we want you to understand that when we're talking about humility, we're talking about certain characteristics, and it may not be what automatically comes to mind when you think humility, but what we're seeing is this kind of humility where they don't focus on themselves, they're not worried about themselves, they're really focused on serving the organization. And there's a lot of things in their characteristics of the humility that they're trying to define that end up being closer to the biblical idea than a lot of the popular ideas and definitions of humility, where it's about thinking less of ourselves. In particular, that's one of the things that they're trying to say is, it's not that these people lack confidence. They had confidence. It's just that they didn't shine the spotlight on themselves. They weren't concerned about their privilege, their status. In fact, one of the things about Darwin Smith, mild manner, in-house lawyer, no airs of self-importance, nerdy black rimmed glasses, and his style sense seemed to be inspired by J.C. Penney's. This is not the guy who's the preening peacock who stands and wants to be seen by everybody. So this book and these observations really lie behind the beginning of the recognition of saying, wait a second, leadership and humility seem to go together. And since the book came out, I think it was about 2003, almost every book that deals with humility and leadership and recognizes it will end up in some way quoting or recognizing Collins's work as being an influence on that. And so I say, in many ways, Collins's study placed humility back on the pages of leadership. For those who defend or reference humility in their analysis of leadership, the mention of Collins's work is not far behind. But I want to ask this question. It's a fair question to ask, and it's one of the things that you wade into this leadership literature. And the question is, do leadership and humility go together? And part of the answer from the leadership literature is not everyone sees it. We have a question.
What was Collins' first name?
Jim Collins, Good to Great is the name of the book. He's written a number of different leadership books. I think he's excellent because of his way is through statistical research, and he works within a team. So he analyzes a lot of data, and he has a team of people who work with him, and then they report it. So I think he offers a lot of good things in the area of leadership. Collins's research placed. So I want to begin with this question as a way into the discussion about humility and leadership, which is, do humility and leadership really go together? Because the reality is not everyone sees it. In one of the most well-known and long-standing works on leadership, How to Win Friends and Influence People, Dale Carnegie mentions humility once in 285 pages. And in the context where he mentions it, this is what he basically says. Be willing to talk about your own mistakes when you correct others' mistakes. If a few sentences humbling oneself and praising the other party can turn a haughty, insulted Kaiser into a staunch friend, imagine what humility and praise can do for you and me in our daily context. And so here he's saying, well, be willing to lower yourself as a tool so that you can have influence and win friends, and so that you can move yourself forward. Kind of missing the main mark there of what the biblical idea of humility is about. Now, here's another example. John Maxwell, 21 indispensable qualities of a leader. And you would sit there and go, so you're making a list and you decided on 21 and you go, here are the qualities that a leader needs to have, which is very character traits. These are the most essential. 21, it's a lot. It's not, your top 5, it's your top 21. Not once in this entire book does he ever mention the word humility. Now, he does mention the word servant, and there is this overlap of conceptual ideas about servant leadership and humility. What's interesting about it is there's almost a study avoidance of the term humility, a little bit along the lines of what we found in Collins, where he probably, now, and John Maxwell, before he became a leadership guru and a national public speaker on the issue of leadership, he was a pastor. And he's functioning out of his Christian beliefs. And so there's almost like this study avoidance of the term humility, because he doesn't want people to think of some of the negative ideas associated with humility. Thinking less of yourself, a mealy-mouthed person who doesn't have confidence and doubts their self-worth, which derives from some of the negative pictures about how people view humility. And there's a story behind that we'll talk about in a little bit. Warren Bennis is another example, a well-known expert author. This book has been published for probably the last 30, 40 years at least. Let's see here. Oh yeah, even longer than that. 31 years. So, and a good book on leadership. Again, he's not a Christian, secular, great ideas. I actually read this. This was a book that I read in my first class on leadership when I was in seminary back in 1992. And not once in this entire book do you ever hear, or even hear a concept that's close to humility. So I could go through and I could list more books for you, and there's quite a few where nothing. Now, on one level, when you're dealing with secular books, you sit there and you go, okay, I mean, it is a uniquely Christian virtue. For Christians, it's something that we should be worried about. But if it's a non-Christian, I get it. But there is a whole section of leadership where it's being written by Christian authors, sometimes outward, and then sometimes towards the church. I'll give you an example. Chris Lowney wrote a book called Heroic Leadership, and he had spent 7 years as a Jesuit seminarian. He learned valuable lessons from the success of the Jesuit order. And so in this book, he offers the best practices from this 450-year-old organization on how to lead. 336 pages long. And here is somebody who is writing out of expertise of leading out in the world, but whose background is Christian, particularly Catholic, is a trained Jesuit, but chose not to go into the Jesuit order. But he is bringing all that he learned from this order and how he learned it and how it's helped him be successful in the business world, of saying, here are these ancient practices and techniques hammered out over 450 years. And this, from monasticism, which, and as a little context we'll get into probably next week, at the center of the monastic movement for more than 1,000 years was the pursuit of humility. But in this book of 336 pages, you will not find the word humility once. Now, this is a Christian writing outward, but you will also find the same reality for those who are offering guidance on how to lead the church. Alan Roxburgh and Fred Romanok have written a leadership book about missional leadership. And this is, in particular, this whole issue of the changing church context. And in Christendom, the church could just kind of be a parish that focused on the care of souls, doing marriages, doing funerals, leading worship on Sunday morning, and the focus of reaching outward and being missional within our own cultural context was somewhat lost. And they go, but now the church needs to be missional. We need to be the church out in the world. We can't assume that they're just going to come anymore. And then in this book, which is talking about how to be missional, which is written by Christians, which is written towards the church and the leadership of the church, they go on and they make this statement. Missional leadership is first about the leader's character and formation. Character is a matter of personal habits, skills, and behaviors that engender confidence and credibility. It also involves the leader's motivations, values, and sense of life purpose. Character is the place where one's deep hunger, personal identity, and calling merge to generate the confidence that allows people to trust the leader and agree to journey together in a new direction. A lot of leadership and ministry, and we'll hear this later as far as just kind of how do we define and understand leadership, it is about trust. And it is about the fact that in the end, people look and there is this relationship where there's a sense of trust that this person will lead us well, and so we're willing to follow. After such a stirring call to emphasize the importance of character, they identify 4 personal qualities paramount to missional leadership in the church: maturity, conflict management, personal courage, and trustworthiness. Nowhere, anywhere in their analysis is any idea of humility or even a conception resembling humility. Nowhere. And so that's the part where you sit back and you read through the literature, and sometimes you just look at it and go, people don't see it. You just won't even come across the word. And so there's still this gap between, not everybody sees leadership and humility going together. But since Collins, there is a growing consensus, and there is more literature that's being offered where it will recognize and name that humility is something important. Now, from Collins, what you have is that you have this call that if you want to be the very best leader that you can be, then humility is one of the primary focuses of character that you should be pursuing in order to reach your leadership potential. And this was a little bit where this is what inspired my own research and study into this. There is no known clinical intervention from any sense of, at least from a psychological sense of how do we help people grow, of helping people develop humility. And that's what I was leaning into, is a way in which we can participate with the Spirit's work of really having humility, but not just any humility, not a general definition of humility, definitely not the way that is popular for the world to define humility, because that creates a lot of tension, and we'll talk about that. But what I was concerned with was the biblical idea of humility, which I think is so central to having Christ formed within us. Now, there is this movement where, since Collins's work, you're beginning to see more people think about and identify and recognize that humility actually does go very well with leadership. Stephen Covey is fairly well known, 7 Habits of a Highly Effective People. And what's interesting is that in his first work, he never recognized it. But later on, he revised that work, and in an expanded section at the end, where he reflects 20 years later on this issue of kind of the qualities and traits that really help people be successful and how leaders can move forward. One of the things that he names is humility. And what he says is that I've come to believe that humility is the mother of all virtues. And this is wisdom that he's really echoing the Christian monastic tradition. That humility helps elevate all of the virtues and helps form all of the positive virtues that really help people be who God created them to be. Somebody else, where did I have that? Somebody else that I would recommend is Patrick Lencioni as far as leadership. He's Catholic. His focus is really on trying to help equip and speak into specifically leadership for organizations. He has a consulting firm, written a number of excellent books that he ends up writing in kind of a parable form. And so when he talks about building the very best leadership teams to help lead organizations, one of the things that he talks about is one of the 3 key virtues that constitute building an ideal leadership team is this issue of humility. And so since Collins, a number of books, I will name some of them for you. One of the things that we find, though, is oftentimes, even though there's a growing consensus, there is often what you'll find in the literature is some sort of an apology of where they'll say, humility really is a quality that leaders should have, and a need to defend against some sort of an attack that would presume that humility and leadership don't go together. So this comes from Joseph Stowell, Redefining Leadership, Character-Driven Habits of Effective Leadership. When we think of effective leadership and the necessary traits to pull it off, humility most likely doesn't rank at the top of the list. Effective leadership usually conjures up thoughts of confidence, gravitas, an intimidating presence, an enviable profile, and while some literature may tip its hat to humility, it is most often viewed as too soft and deferring to be effective. And here he's defending humility, but he feels like he needs to apologize for defending it because so many people in the past have looked at it negatively, and it's not something that you typically associate with leadership when you have these other images of this powerful, engaging, dynamic leader who people just sit there and are in awe of. And humility seems counterintuitive to that. Now, one of the things that happens when people end up promoting humility with leadership is there is this sense we've got to define the term right. It's what Collins did. and it's the characteristic throughout the leader. When I say humility, what I mean is something like this, not prideful, but what I don't mean is something like this, somebody who lacks confidence. Here's an example, Dr. Henry Cloud, and he has a book called Integrity, and he writes, the kind of character and identity confidence is a paradox of humility. Upon first glance, the confident, I am good at this person is not what we think of as the picture of humble. But at the same time, because these people are also certain of who they are not, and what they are not good at, they do not come across as grandiose or just confident. They don't come across as grandiose, they just come across as confident. Humiliating is not self-deprecating, but it is real and honest. When someone who is who he or she really is and does not act as if he or she is more than he is, that is not arrogance, but it's secure identity. And you start to read through these things, and you start to work with your biblical understanding of humility, and then you start to sit there and go, yeah, I'm in agreement with this. Humility is, to have humility doesn't mean that you can't have confidence. In fact, humility really should promote a very honest, candid self-understanding. And so now, what is often associated with humility as somebody who may have low self-esteem, thinking less of yourself and thinking that you're of not much worth, now it becomes this part about really somebody who has an accurate self-estimate. I know my strengths, I know my weaknesses, and I can honestly tell you my strengths and my weaknesses. This is who I am. I'm not all that I'm supposed to be. This is, if I'm a Christian, I especially know this. I'm growing up in Christ. I want to be conformed to his image. And within all of this, I'm a learner, I'm a grower, and humility promotes all of that. And now you can just be in the system, and this is something, for example, of Goleman. One of the things about primal leadership and people with emotional intelligence is that they are a non-anxious presence within the system. And non-anxious presence people help everybody else come up and become better of who they are. Well, humility is something that promotes that. Goleman never sees it and doesn't mention it. But as we begin to wrap our arms around humility and we begin to interact with these ideas, we can begin to sit there and say, oh, look, humility really is valuable, and here's why. Collins himself insists that you have to define humility correctly. Indeed, he writes, we debated for a long time on the research team how to describe the good to great leaders. Initially, we penciled terms like selfless executive and servant leader, but members of the team violently objected to these characterizations. Those labels don't ring true. It makes them sound weak or meek, but that's not all the way I think of Darwin Smith or Coleman Wackler. And then they said, well, let's call them level 5 leadership. And then let's define these terms, humility and iron will, so that people can understand what sets them apart. The constant apology for humility seems twofold. In part, humility has become a loaded term in modern society. It is a concept so closely tied with the teachings of Jesus Christ that those who helped push Western civilization past Christendom sought to undercut the virtue. André Lauf wrote a book called The Way of Humility. And there what he offers is the wisdom of the early church fathers and the monastic movements of their comments on humility spreading over a 1,000-year period. And in the beginning he offers this nice little introduction. And in it he's leaning into where we stand in the 20th century, and we've maybe progressed just a little bit more from there, but where we stand as far as the state of humility in our culture. And he calls them the masters of suspicion. You go back and you begin with Hume and Nietzsche and Freud, and then even somebody moving forward like Adler. And all of these writers and influencers of culture attacked the biblical idea of humility. And part of their attack was to undermine the teachings of Jesus and the place of the church in society. So Hume called humility a monkish virtue and saw it as a despising thing. You move forward to Nietzsche, and it is something that is for the weak. And then Freud probably most effectively comes forward and begins to label it as something that is neurotic. It's this self-loathing sort of a thing, and this is what Christianity was really about. And so this is a part in our society where there's this one part where humility was elevated as a central virtue, and for the monastic movement for 1,000 years, kind of the chief focus of kind of the virtue, or the mother of all virtues to pursue, that would help you conform into Christ likeness. And then another movement that began to push the church out, one of its targets became humility. And there was this definition of humility that began to get influenced particularly by psychology, of self-loathing, of low self-esteem, that has effectively kind of created a little bit of ambiguity in our culture about what we think about humility. And so that whole dynamic is something that has seeped into this leadership literature, where, okay, we see this thing and there's something good here, there's something positive here, but as we're seeing it, it's not these things, but it's this over here, and we're using the term humility. The second thing that you see among the literature is that while there's something redeemable in the concept that these authors who say, yes, humility goes with leadership, there is an overall recognition that humility is a large and somewhat fuzzy concept with very nuances that require explanation. And this is just the part where there's a general sense of the idea of humility, thinking less of yourselves. And then there's some aspects where we see people who seem to be humble and we find them attractive, and we can't quite seem to bring it all together about, okay, so how do they come across as, not being, just kind of these weak people who despise themselves, but they don't think of themselves too highly. Now, for Christians, this may just be easier for us because we focus on Jesus, and what we know is that he's humble. Now, my argument is humility and leadership really do go together. But one of the things that we need to recognize, and this is, so now is understanding leadership and how humility fits in leadership, but also at a larger level, understanding that your way of approaching leadership and talking about leadership may influence how open and readily you recognize that humility and leadership really go together. Now, moving into just kind of giving a review of leadership literature. Leadership literature has become a huge industry. At every level of society, we will find different types of books on different types of leadership, and it is a money-making industry. And within this is the part where everybody's offering their own definitions. Everybody has their own ideas. They take their own tacks. And so leadership becomes this large concept. And within that, we should have some level of humility, that just trying to wrap our arms around this literature and kind of coming to some of the key parts of understanding, what is leadership really? And in it, there's going to be a little bit of going, what definition of leadership am I going to give prominence? Because everybody offers their definitions of leadership. And what I'd like to do with the rest of our time is to begin talking a little bit about some of the key things that I've seen as far as just giving some good ideas to help us wrap our minds around what really is leadership. Now, a lot of people will actually, that when you read into the topic of leadership, they will be like Warren Bennis, and they will tell you that, leadership is actually hard to define. And Bennis writes it this way. He says, to an extent, leadership is like beauty. Hard to define, but you know it when you see it. You can have people who very clearly are exercising leadership and effectively leading, and they can look very different, and the way they do it can be very different, but you sit there and go, that person's leading well, and that person is leading well. And so Bennis doesn't offer a simple definition of leadership. Instead, what he ends up doing is he talks about some of the things that really help people become the effective leaders. Dan Allender, which I don't think I've mentioned yet, wrote a book called Leading with a Limp. He's writing as a Christian, and he is giving a Christian argument for a particular type of leadership. He ended up becoming the leader and forming a Christian seminary in Seattle called Mars Hills, and a lot of what he has to say about leadership is out of that experience. And I think this is an excellent book, especially for Christians, because I think it's going to help us think more biblically about how to lead. Because some of the pictures that we get in the leadership literature are a little bit more of an Ayn Rand sort of this heroic figure who, just stands heads and shoulders above everybody else in their own strength and integrity, and there is this overpowering sense of confidence and magnetism and ability and all of these things, and this is going to take a much different approach than that, about sitting there saying the very best things that will make you a leader are coming to terms with your brokenness and your weakness, which as Christians, we sit there and go, we're all broken, we all have points of weakness, and Christ's power seems to be demonstrated best through our weaknesses. So great book. Allender gives a more egalitarian sort of definition, and I would support this. A leader is anyone who is moved to influence others to engage a problem or an opportunity for good. I think every Christian in some way is called into leadership, called to be influencers, called to in some way step into the gap and to use the gifts and abilities that God has given you to help move things towards the good in particular people. One of the things that you'll find is that most everybody agrees that leaders are made and they aren't born. That's a statement that Bennis makes, for example, and you'll find an echo of that throughout much of the literature. Now, you'll find different emphasis. Bennis sits there and he says, made more by themselves than by external means. But at the very same time, Bennis has a whole chapter in his book that says, communities and organizations create cultures, and some communities and cultures will help foster bringing leadership potential out of people, and some will stifle it. Somebody like Bill Robinson will come into this and he will say, leaders are definitely made, not born, but if any parent would know, DNA does seem to play a part. And so there seems to be this mixture of both. And he's offering all of this as a hope of sitting there saying, there's not one temperament. You don't have to be an extrovert, or you don't have to be an introvert. You don't have to be a thinker or a feeler in order to be an effective leader. You can be different than other people, But within it all, you're going to have your innate strengths, and you're also going to have your innate weaknesses. And for you to become an effective leader, some of it's going to be through this forging process that they all say isn't easy. The call to leadership, and we talked about this last week, is going to be a call that will probably humble you, and it will challenge you. And that's exciting, because it's going to help Christ be formed in you, especially if you engage in all of this very intentionally. Is Jesus calling me into this? Okay, I'm going to respond, I'm going to do it, and I'm going to do it with him. And in all of this, then, his will, that's what I want. And some of his will is for you and I to be conformed into his image and into his likeness. Now, Bennis, focusing on people who get put into positions of leadership, he says, unlike most people, leaders end up taking all of the different circumstances, and they're able to use these things, and they become more than just the sum of their experiences. And Allender will write, the difference between a manager and a leader is the internal urge to alter the status quo to create a different world. We all have leadership potential, but we may not always step into the leadership. And some of it is that willingness to risk, and as we are willing to fail and learn from our failures and then grow, that actually is part of the path of leadership. And I think about this in our context of the Tri-Cities, where we're in this engineering scientific community that is so often, because of the power that they're dealing with, especially nuclear power, of cautions and safety procedures and protocols, that there's a culture that sometimes is avoidance of risk-taking. But sometimes in life you gotta take a risk. Sometimes you gotta be willing to try and fail. And leaders are people who are so committed to trying to get there that they'll be willing to fall, but they're going to try to get back up again with everybody so that we can keep moving, because we can learn something through the midst of the failure. You'll find this sort of discussion within the literature. Max Dupree, who I mentioned, offers a definition of leadership. And very much like Bennis, he says it's not easy to find. And so it's right in his title. Leadership is an art. Something to be learned over time, not simply by reading books. Leadership is more tribal than scientific, more the weaving of relationships than the amassing of information. And in this sense, I don't know how to pin it down in every detail. And what you get is that you can have a simplistic definition of leadership, and that simplistic definition of leadership, if you limit your understanding of leadership to that, it will probably actually misguide you. You have some sort of a framework of saying, leadership looks something like this, but in the end, there is this part where it's not easy to just pin down everything. You can know all the theory. You could read all of these books, and it doesn't mean that you're ready to be a leader. Part of it is you got to live it. You got to live into it. And one of the things that comes in the definition, and this is the part that I really focused on, is that everybody ends up agreeing that one of the fundamental parts of leadership is character. And this is where humility and leadership intersect. Everybody agrees that if you're going to lead, it's about having a certain type of character. And the argument that I would make, and that many have now begun to make, is humility is an essential part of that character. Now, one of the things that I'm bringing to this discussion is I think most people's working definition of humility is deficient of the New Testament ideal. There was a question.
Yeah. Which author said that leaders want to move beyond the status quo?
Let's see. That was Allender. The difference between a manager and a leader is the internal urge to alter the status quo to create a different world. There's a funny thing, you get into this literature on leadership and you'll start getting these different terms defined: manager, leader, and sometimes there'll be this contrast. Managers will be seen as negative, leaders will be seen as positive. There's places for both sorts of skill sets, and and so there's a little bit. You read into this. There's just these larger conversations going on in the background across the leadership literature. So in Allender, he's functioning out of that. He's promoting the concept of leader over manager, and manager becomes a negative. You'll get into some other works, and they'll give definitions of managers where it's a positive thing, but it's just seen as a different thing. So as you get into this, and if you haven't read a lot into this literature, just realize that you'll find those differences. To become a leader who leads well is a life's work. Again, remember the quote that I began with Darwin Smith. I just always thought that there was more to learn to get better so that I could become qualified for this job. Many will define leadership, and I think that if you're a Christian, you're going to support this, that leadership is a life focused on serving others. The first responsibility of a leader, this is Max Dupree, is to define reality. The last is to say thank you. In between the two, the leader must become a servant and debtor. This sums up the progress of an artful leader. To be a leader means especially having the opportunity to make a meaningful difference in the lives of those who permit leaders to lead. Now, at this, I'm going to take you back into our last chapter and our building of leadership, of a theology of humility and leadership. And when we're talking about leadership in the ancient world, and the words for leadership in the ancient world, remember just how different of a conception leadership was. Because in that section, I quoted this quote of Dupree. And there was no way that Caesar ever saw himself in any way as anything of what Dupree is giving as a definition for leadership. And so we come in and we go, yeah, there's a wide variance of leadership. And so when we're reading our Bibles and we're reading, here's this leader, and if we're projecting our 20th or 21st century ideas of leadership, which I think ring true of what real good leadership looks like, we would completely mischaracterize the way that they were thinking and defining leadership back in the first century. But if we look at the way of Jesus, what we'll find is his way and his wisdom ends up being reflected in much of what is getting promoted now in leadership literature. It's 7:31, so we have reached the end of this hour, and I would really love to hear comments about, how are you experiencing the material for tonight? I kind of make the assumption that the biblical theological stuff will be interesting for us Christians, and so now I'm taking you into a little bit broader world of the leadership literature. I think there's great things in here, but I don't want to lose my audience either. So let me know how tonight went, and if you like the pace, if I need to pick it up a little bit, skip some things, I can do that. But have a wonderful night, and if you're watching this not live but later, I want to encourage you to continue this dialogue with me, and you can comment as well. You can comment straight on the Facebook page. We will read those comments later, or send me an email. But have a wonderful evening, and God bless. Good night.